Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Last month, the Iraqi cabinet approved a draft budget of $102.5 billion for 2015, based on projected oil prices of $60 a barrel and a projected deficit of $19.1 billion. But oil prices have dropped further to $50 this month, and with the projected deficit as well as the controversies surrounding the budget, will the Iraqi government be able to honor its constitutional agreement to provide the autonomous Kurdistan region with its full 17% of the budget? We will deal with this question and much more with our next guest, Sabah Alnasseri. He's joining us from Toronto, Canada. Professor Alnasseri teaches at the Department of Political Science at York University. Thank you so much for joining us, Sabah.
Thanks for having me, Sharmini.
So, Sabah, let's start with why the draft budget wasn't approved in the first place.
Right. First of all, the irony is the Islamic State released its budget on January the 15th for 2015 with $2 billion and 250 million surpluses. And again, so much to the U.S. degradation of Islamic State, whereas the Iraqi state doesn't have a budget now. The problem is, actually, there are multiple problems. The first one is the oil-producing and gas-producing provinces, they wanted $5 premiums on each produced barrel or 150 cubic gas, but they get only $2. So that's one of the problems and one of the conflict fields. The second one, there was a critique from the so-called religious institution on some aspect of the draft, especially concerning the social issues. And the third conflict, of course, there are some accusation among political forces that the central government, or at least al-Abadi government, gave too much concession to Kurdistan, considering it's only one region of Iraq compared to other regions. The fourth conflict, of course, you have different ministries, and these ministries, with their cliques and clans, each one of them want to have a big share of the budget. But as we said, almost 50% of the budget goes to these four ministries. Now, with this endemic corruption in these different institutions, I assume there will be a fight over the percentage of the budget going to different institutions and how this will be spent. And again, the fifth problem was that the budget was based on $60 per barrel in December. Now it's way below than 54 barrels. Again, there are some demands that the budget should be revised according to a realistic estimation of the oil prices. And there is no indicator that the oil prices will increase within the next few months and so on. So these are some of the conflict fields around the budget and why it's not approved. And I hope, or I assume that the budget might be approved by the end of January. But again, even if it's approved, this will not solve the problem.
Sabah, so give us some idea of the controversies surrounding the budget and why this budget share with the regional Kurdistan government is constitutionally guaranteed.
Well, first of all, as I said in the last interview, the cabinet approved the budget draft on December 23rd, 2014. But the draft is not approved by the parliament yet. Yesterday's session of the parliament, there was no item on the agenda discussing the budget draft. It's still discussed within the so-called finance committee of the parliament. But maybe before talking about the budget draft, we should talk about the context within which the draft is discussed. And what do we see? We see multiple crises. And if we look at the last developments, the first thing is we don't have a budget from 2014 due to the conflict between the al-Maliki government, Kurdistan, and other political rivals of al-Maliki. There was a depletion of the Iraqi reserve and monies from the Iraqi Development Fund, an account at the Fed in New York, from $10 billion to $3 billion. And the second thing, since the attack and occupation of Islamic State since June 2014, and the bombing of the so-called coalition of the Willings, led to not only to the death of 10,000 of civilians and the internal displacement of over 2 million Iraqis, people losing their jobs, their income, increasing the unemployment and their misery, but also due to the occupation of more than 1 million hectare land by Islamic State, especially of wheat crops, which create and will create a food crisis, or at least will increase the prices for food. On the other hand, we still suffer from the endemic corruption, the dysfunctional institutions, and conflict and rivalries among different political elites, clans, and cliques within the states and between the central government and the provinces, not only with Kurdistan, but other provinces. So if we look at these multiple crises, then we can discuss the significance of this budget draft and what possible problem and conflict would arise from this budget draft.
So, Sabah, then give us some context to the 17% allocated in the constitution to the regional government of Kurdistan, and why this came about, and whether the government will be able to deliver on that constitutional guarantee.
Right. I mean, this agreement between Kurdistan and the central government was actually the precondition for the budget draft. Without solving the problem with Kurdistan, it was almost impossible for al-Abadi government to draft the budget. So one of the things is the problem with the Maliki government and the non-transfer of salaries and so on to Kurdistan. You have a lot of people, especially now in Suleimania, in the province of Suleimania, public employees going on strike because they didn't receive their salary since October 2014. And there were conflict around the percentage of the oil produced in Kurdistan, how much of this oil would be regulated and controlled and operated by Kurdistan, and how much would go to the central government. So what the deal struck by Kurdistan and the central government anticipate that 17% of the budget will be transferred to Kurdistan based on the 17% of oil production that Kurdistan contributes to Iraq, and 83% roughly is produced actually in the south in Basra. But that's not only the 17%. We will talk about this when we talk about the draft. If you look at the amount of oil, according to the new agreement and the budget draft, that is produced in Kurdistan is 250,000 barrels from the Kurdistan region per day and 300,000 from Kirkuk. So that means altogether 550,000 barrels of oil per day Kurdistan is allowed to produce, and this will go to the central government. Anything beyond that, and that's the problem, which is not actually clarified in the budget draft and in the agreement. Anything beyond that is not clear. Who will benefit from that? How it's going to be used, or is it going to be consumed within Kurdistan? What about the oil already exported, especially now stored at the Seyhan in Turkey? So there are other payments and transfers which are not really fixed, and that would create problems because the agreement based on the good faith of both parts. So if any one of the partners interpret the agreement a different way, this would cause a conflict and again struggle over revenues and resources.
Right. And then you were saying, what else is in the draft?
Right. So first of all, let's look at the budget, anticipated budget. And this budget was estimated in December 2014, taken into consideration the price of oil at that time, which is $60 per barrel, which is not realistic anymore. It is changing almost every day. So based on this estimation, the budget was estimated by roughly $104 billion, and 83 billions the estimated revenue of the state, mostly based on oil. So there's almost 20% deficit anticipated in the budget for 2015. And as I said, this estimation and the calculation of the budget is not only not realistic due to the falling and collapsing actually oil prices at the world market, but due to other problems. If you want me to refer to these problems in the draft, I would be more than happy to do
Yes,
that.
Definitely.
The other resources that the state is anticipating to at least to cover some 13% of the budget are customs and taxes. Indirect taxes on, I don't know, cell phones, new cars, tourism, traveling, etc. And the other one is in custom revenues. But if you look at, on both cases, you will see, if we look at the customs, what do you see? You see mostly the major trade routes of Iraq are either controlled by ISIS, especially going to Syria or Jordan or Turkey, or there's an endemic corruption and organized crime and smuggling. So the revenue anticipated are not realistic. On the other hand, the indirect taxes, again, based on the assumption that increased employment and increased income, etc., which is not the case. There's an economic crisis, and there's increased unemployment and a decrease in demand because due to the uncertainties and low incomes. So even these estimations are not accurate. This will not only the collapsing of the oil prices, but also this revenue, anticipated revenue, will not materialize, which would make the budget deficit even greater than 20%.
Right. So with these impediments in place in order for the government to deliver on what is a reasonable expectation on the part of Iraqi people to be provided with some services and guarantees of life and livelihood and employment, how is it going to compensate for this larger deficit you're projecting?
Right. So one of the issues this draft is trying to resolve, but actually I would say it would create more problem, which is the relationship between the central government and the provinces. So what the budget now anticipates is to increase the premium for the oil producing and gas producing provinces from $1 per barrel a day to $2. That means 100% increase. It anticipates an increase in the oil production in Basra, which is, I would say, unrealistic due to technical and other problems. So the anticipation that the oil fields in Basra would increase the oil production in 2015 is unrealistic. The second problem is that these provinces, especially the resource-rich provinces, not only in Kurdistan, but also in the south, are pushing for more autonomy when it comes to revenues, investment, governance, etc., which would create problem to population-rich provinces, yet resource-poor provinces like in western, northwestern of Iraq, which will create conflict among these provinces on the one hand and between these provinces and the central government. Now, with the war going on against ISIS and the loss of agricultural land and some trade routes, and again, the economic crisis and the increase of unemployment, it is surprising to see that almost 50% of the budget will go to 4 ministries, which is the Interior, Defense, Oil, and Finance. That means the Social Security, all of the ministries of the state are under-financed in a way. So I can't see how the government will finance these, social project, infrastructure, and so on with this economic crisis and the anticipated budget deficit.
Now, Sabah, the budget allocation seems a little peculiar in terms of the mission of any state is to really service its people, but the allocation seems to be for oil and for defense and very little for ordinary people.
Right. Right. As I said, the first problem is, you see, Iraq in the last few years, they had enormous surpluses from oil revenue. But in contrast to the GCC countries, the Gulf countries, these countries created, a sovereign wealth fund, and they used these for investment, especially in time of crisis. Iraq didn't have such a fund, and the second thing is, as I said, since the oil prices are collapsing, and the estimation of revenue from customs and taxes is unrealistic. The harsh reality which the Iraqi people will face is austerity measure, cut in salaries of public employee, which is the biggest sector of employment in Iraq, about 6 million people working in the state institutions. So they will face harsh austerity measures. And since the budget draft, there's a provision empowering the minister president to borrow money and to at least to close the gaps and holes in the deficit or the anticipated bigger deficit. That will also create a burden on the population and will increase taxes. And the third problem, of course, the central bank will probably use the reserve, the foreign currency reserve, which means that it will contribute to the inflation of the Iraqi currency, and again, it will hit the people everyday lives hardly. So that's why I think this budget draft will create much more problems and instabilities and exacerbate the economic crisis more than the current situation.
Sabah, I want to thank you so much for joining us and explaining these very important issues to us and understanding what's really going on in Iraq through the prism of the budget.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.